The person who first created this taxonomy of organisms is known as Carolus Linnaeus. In 1758, he wanted to create a simpler way to be able to identify organisms. The problem with this is that there are many different languages in the entire world, and it would be really hard to be able to identify that language, so be able to identify that organism, so all the languages will be able to accept it. So he used Latin, since Latin was anyway a dead language and no one really used it for communication. But also Latin was also an influence on all the other languages in the Mediterranean and European world. Hence the reason why a lot of organisms' scientific name is in Latin. So now let's start off with the taxonomy. Taxonomy is basically this classification of organisms based on their unique or different characteristics. So for example, one organism might have a DNA in the nucleus, but the other might just have DNA floating around, like eukaryote or prokaryote, or one might be able to reproduce, but the other can't. Let's just take an example. As we're going through the taxonomy process, let's try to identify the human scientific name. So first, let's start off with domain. There are 3 different domains. One is bacteria, one is archaea, and one is eukarya. Bacteria, as we already know, is the very small unicellular organisms or prokaryotes that squirm around in very small or very tight places. And typically they could be found where, like in swamps or forests, where it allows them to survive. There's a lot of multi-diversity in the area. Next, we have archaea. Archaea is a special type of bacteria. Instead of thriving in some kind of tight or small spaces, it survives in very extreme spaces. These extreme spaces can be either very harsh cold like Antarctica or very hot like in a volcano. And lastly, we have eukarya, which are just all the eukaryotic organisms. Eukaryotic organisms have a nucleus, and the DNA is located in the nucleus. They're multicellular, and they're able to reproduce. And they're also able to grow. Humans are under the eukarya domain because obviously, according to eukarya characteristics, the human characteristics match that. So next, we're going to move to kingdom. We have eubacteria, which is part of bacteria, archaea, which is part of archaea. Then we have protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia, which is part of eukarya. So protista is basically just protists. Protist is kind of like the junk drawer of the entire classification. Any organism that's not considered fungi, plants, or an animal is part of protists. Then we have fungi. Fungi is basically those decomposing organisms. Then we have plants and animals. Humans are part of the animal category. Next, when we go into phylum, when we dig deeper, we're only talking about the animal kingdom. But of course, there's a different one for like plantae, different one for fungi, different one for protista, different one for archaea, different one for eubacteria. So each section has its own way of taxonomy based on the characteristics that the organisms inside of it share. So right now we're talking about animalia because humans are part of the animalia, and we're going through the human classification over here. So when we dig deep into the phylum, we have arthropoda, chordata, mollusca, and we have like 6 other different types of categories, but they're not exactly as important as these 3 over here, since these 3 are the most common. Animalia are grouped in phylum based on the same body plan, okay? So when I talk about body plan, I mean comparing vertebrates versus invertebrates, or like how the skeletal system goes, or like how they move or something like that. So here we have arthropoda. Arthropoda are basically like organisms with these external skeletons. And what I mean by that is the skeleton is like really close to the skin, and matter of fact, they have like their entire body is jointed. So we can see this in like spiders, crabs, centipedes, and millipedes. Then we have chordata. These are internal skeletal organisms. These basically have the skeletons inside the body, and the skeletons don't exactly show out like the arthropoda. Things like mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fish are chordata. And lastly, we have mollusca. Mollusca is basically where they have a skeleton, but it's mainly located at where the motion of the body is, which is basically the foot. and the soft, unsegmented part of the body. So, for example, snails, octopuses, and clams mainly have the skeleton at the bottom where their motion or feet are, because that's how they're able to move, and that's where it's most important. So, that's why. These are just 3 out of the 9 different possible categories that are located in phylum. So, humans are located in the chordata part since they're mammals and have internal skeletons and a backbone. Okay, then in chordata, they could be further classified into mammalia, amphibia, aves or like birds. Then we have fish and then reptiles. They're classified like vertebrates versus invertebrates, or like other kinds of body plans in their system. So like as we already know, humans are part of the mammalia family because they're mammals. Then when we go to order, we have basically like herbivores versus carnivores versus omnivores versus autotrophs versus heterotrophs, where we see that humans are grouped into primates, which are basically like humans, apes, lemurs, monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas, etc. So this is basically part of their same order. Examples can be Chiroptera, which are basically bats, and then Rodentia, which are rodents like mice, rats, prairie dogs, And then now let's move deeper into primates. Primates then are classified or grouped into hominid, canidae, which include dogs, wolves, and foxes, and Felidae, which includes cats, lions, and tigers. Hominidae, which basically means human beings, and human beings include like Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, the different human species that used to exist like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And after family, we're gonna move to genus. So when we talk about genus, it's basically one entire big family of different species. So like basically consider different cat breeds. When we consider different cat breeds, they're all part of the same genus. However, of course, they're different cat breeds, right? So what makes a cat breed different is based on very little details in its characteristics. And basically, this comes from the evolutionary history that it went through. Like, for example, some cats in like the northern part might have thicker fur, but from the southern part, they might not. They might have a darker like fur color, but whatever it is. The cat breeds, they all come from the same family, which is the genus. But the species is what makes the cat different based on its evolutionary history from different parts around the world. And same thing can be said about humans. So when we look at humans, they all come from one same species, which is basically like the monkey species. And we apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, different human species like Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens. They're all part of the same family. But what makes the difference is their evolutionary history. Gorillas and apes are not similar because they live in different parts of the world and have adapted to different climates and different kinds of foods, and that's what makes them distinct. Hence, they have a different species name. And same thing can be said about human species. Neanderthalensis were living in like Europe, basically like the northern part of the world, but Homo sapiens were living more in Africa. Homo erectus were living more in Asia, and then there were it's other human species were living elsewhere. But that's what made them different, because of their evolutionary distinction through the history that they shared together. The family divides into genus. So we're part of the Homo genus, and then when we go into species, we're part of the sapiens species. So that's what we are, Homo sapiens. Now, when we look at it, all the human species are extinct except for Homo sapien, which is basically us. So Homo comes from the genus name because that's how all of us are related, from the same family, but sapiens is the species name because of the evolutionary history that we share that other species in our family do not share. Okay, so that's basically the entire thing. And the reason why we only include the genus and species name and not everything else is because this would be a way too long of a name. Like, who wants to say Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Primate, Hominid, Homo sapiens? No one wants to say that. So according to the binomenclature, basically we take the genus and the species name, and what we do is we combine them together and we create that Latin identity of that species. And now when we're trying to say that Latin name, like when we're trying to type it or when we're trying to write it, there are different ways we have to specify it in writing. So like if you're typing it, it has to be italicized. When you're talking about like a species and you're using the Latin name, then the species Latin name has to be italicized when you're typing or when you're texting. However, when you're just writing something, then you have to underline it, and that's so that it gives importance to that species name, and that also helps people interpret that as an important part in like what you're trying to say. So we just talked about how humans were classified over here, but now let's move on to some other kinds of things. So let's take the taxonomy of a dog, okay? So as we see for dog, they're part of eukarya because they're multicellular and they have a nucleus that surrounds the DNA. Then in the kingdom, they're part of course, Animalia. Then they're also mammals, and they also have a backbone, like they're also vertebrates. And since they have like internal skeletal structure, they're part of the chordata family also. Then in the order, they're part of carnivora. Basically, that means that they're able to eat meat. Then in family, they have the Canidae. Like, so in our family over here, we are in the Hominidae. Here they're part of the Canidae. Then in the genus, they're part of Canis, but for our genus, we're part of Homo. Then in their species, they're called lupus, but here we're called sapiens. So you can see the differences once we enter into the family or once we enter into the order, because we see that dogs aren't humans. They're completely different species when it compares to us. However, starting from domain all the way to order, they follow our same characteristics, but starting from family to species, they do not share the same characteristics. Hence, they have a different name compared to us. Lastly, we're going to be looking at a tiger. So when we look at a tiger, we're going to first start off with kingdom. So it's part of the Animalia. It has the internal skeletal structure, so chordata. It's a mammal, it's carnivorous. And Felidae basically means that it's part of the cat family. Any cat, lion, tiger, they're all part of the cat family, so they would have the Felidae as a similar word. But the genus would be Panthera and the species is Tigris. Okay? Panthera is shared with a panther, like a cowgar or mountain lion. Then there's obviously lions and tigers, and this is the genus, so it shares that with some common organisms. However, what makes it unique is the species name Tigris. Tigris is what distincts it from the other organisms in the genus name over here. So that's how we're able to identify. One easy mnemonic to remember the domain to species is Dear King Philip came over for great spaghetti. So this is all about taxonomy. We just looked at some examples in the animal kingdom, but note that there's also the plantae, fungi, protista, archaea, and eubacteria. These different kingdoms have a different way of organization based on their organism patterns, their characteristics share. So this is all about the taxonomy in animals, and this is also how we were able to identify it based on not only the binomial nomenclature, but also through looking at from domain to species.